Ladies and gentlemen, the world we live in today is not the same as yesterday. One single event, one single decision can change the balance of power, shake economies, and rewrite the map of alliances overnight. When Israel struck Qatar, it wasn't just about two nations. It became a story that touched every corner of the globe. Suddenly, markets reacted, leaders took sides, and ordinary people began to ask, what happens next? This is not just a story of politics or war. It is a story of global revenge, of how actions carry consequences far beyond what anyone imagines. It is about how the smallest nation can hold the largest nations accountable, and how power can shift from the hands of the mighty to those who understand the value of unity and trust. Today, I invite you to join me on a journey, one that will take you through the global backlash, the economic shocks, the shifting alliances, the media battles, the rise of new power centers, and even the unexpected turmoil inside Israel itself. Stay with me till the end, because what you will discover is not just what happened after Israel hit Qatar. It is also a glimpse of the world that is being born before our eyes. If you truly want to understand how power works in the 21st century, how one action can trigger a domino effect across the planet, then this speech is for you. So let's begin. The immediate global backlash that followed Israel's strike on Qatar was swift, intense, and widespread, far surpassing what many had anticipated. Within hours of the incident, major world powers convened emergency sessions in international bodies such as the United Nations, calling for urgent resolutions and demanding explanations. The act was not seen merely as a military maneuver, but as a direct provocation that threatened the stability of a region already fragile with tension. Qatar, being a central player in the global energy supply chain, was not viewed in isolation. An attack on it was interpreted as an attack on the security of energy markets, trade partners, and the delicate balance of international cooperation. This is why the condemnation came not only from traditional Middle Eastern allies, but also from European capitals, Asian powers, and even states that typically maintain neutrality in such conflicts. Diplomatic isolation for Israel began almost instantly. Several European nations, which had previously balanced their stance between support for Israel and calls for peace in the Middle East, publicly criticized the decision, warning of sanctions and suspension of bilateral agreements. The strike ignited debates in parliaments across Europe, where leaders voiced concerns about the broader implications for European energy security, given Qatar's importance as a top supplier of LNG. These reactions created an image of Israel standing against the tide of international consensus, increasingly portrayed as a nation unwilling to act within the boundaries of global norms. Beyond governments, the backlash extended to people. Protests erupted in major cities from London and Paris to Berlin and Madrid, with demonstrators demanding accountability and an end to military aggression in the region. The media amplified these reactions, framing Israel not as a state defending its interests, but as one undermining international law and stability. Influential think tanks and analysts warned that such an act risked setting a precedent where raw military power could be used against economically vital states, eroding the trust that held the global system together. The diplomatic outrage also carried symbolic weight. States that had once been cautious in their criticism of Israel now found themselves compelled to take stronger positions, fearing domestic and international backlash if they stayed silent. What began as a regional strike quickly transformed into a matter of global concern, forcing countries to take sides in a conflict they did not want to be drawn into. This atmosphere of universal condemnation marked the beginning of Israel's growing isolation and set the stage for a chain of consequences that rippled across political, economic, and security dimensions worldwide. The strike on Qatar immediately spilled over into the economic domain, where retaliation came not through weapons, but through markets, trade, and financial pressure. Qatar is one of the largest suppliers of liquefied natural gas to Europe and Asia, and the timing of the attack could not have been more disruptive. Global energy markets reacted within hours, with oil and gas prices spiking to levels unseen in years. This sudden surge in energy costs caused panic in European capitals, where reliance on Qatari LNG had become essential after years of recalibrating energy dependence away from Russia. Investors across the globe started pulling back from ventures linked with Israel, fearing that its actions would lead to long-term instability in the Middle East and provoke a wider conflict. Qatar, supported by its allies, moved quickly to weaponize its economic position. Through diplomatic channels, it signaled the possibility of redirecting its LNG exports to countries that stood by it politically, leaving Israel and any sympathetic governments more vulnerable to shortages and price hikes. This energy leverage resonated deeply in Europe, where winter consumption patterns made reliable gas supplies a strategic necessity. The mere hint of supply cuts forced European policymakers to distance themselves from Israel, not only out of moral outrage, but also to secure their nation's energy future. Financial institutions joined the wave of retaliation. Several sovereign wealth funds from the Gulf, which had previously invested heavily in technology and real estate projects tied to Israel, began reconsidering or suspending their commitments. These moves sent a chilling signal to global markets. Doing business with Israel had suddenly become politically costly. Meanwhile, consumer sentiment in parts of the Arab world turned hostile toward companies associated with Israel, leading to boycotts that damaged multinational brands with Israeli partnerships. The trade routes themselves also faced disruptions. Shipping insurers raised premiums for vessels entering Middle Eastern waters, anticipating potential escalation, and logistics companies recalculated risks of moving goods through the region. This indirect form of punishment squeezed Israel's economy further, increasing costs for imports and exports while reducing competitiveness. At the same time, new opportunities arose for rival powers. Nations like Russia and Iran positioned themselves as alternative energy providers, strengthening their global bargaining power. China seized the chance to deepen ties with Qatar, presenting itself as a reliable partner amid crisis. In contrast, Israel found itself increasingly marginalized, with economic isolation becoming not just a fear, but a rapidly unfolding reality. This chain of economic retaliation demonstrated that in today's interconnected world, striking a nation with such a pivotal role in global supply chains invited consequences far beyond the battlefield. The strike on Qatar reshaped alliances in ways that few policymakers had anticipated, igniting a chain reaction across the global political landscape. For years, many nations had remained cautious in their dealings with both Israel and Qatar, choosing neutrality in order to protect their economic or strategic interests. However, the moment Qatar was attacked, silence became impossible. Countries that had once maintained a balancing act were compelled to take clear positions, and most of them leaned toward defending Qatar, both to safeguard energy security and to align themselves with the rising sentiment of global justice. This sudden shift created new coalitions that began to challenge the traditional geopolitical order. In the Middle East, regional rivalries were temporarily set aside as states recognized that an attack on Qatar represented a threat to the collective security of smaller nations in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia, which had previously experienced strained relations with Qatar, publicly extended support, understanding that its own infrastructure could one day face similar risks. The Gulf Cooperation Council, once plagued with divisions, began to unite under the banner of protecting sovereignty against external aggression. This unity not only strengthened Qatar diplomatically, but also sent a message to the wider world that the region was no longer willing to tolerate unilateral actions that endangered stability. Beyond the Middle East, the strike reverberated across Europe and Asia, where alliances began to take new shape. European countries, many of which depended on Qatari LNG to diversify away from Russian energy supplies, found themselves tied more closely to Qatar's security concerns. Their support was not driven only by morality, but also by the practical need to secure vital energy partnerships. In Asia, nations such as China and India seized the opportunity to reaffirm strong relations with Qatar, with China in particular positioning itself as a protector of Gulf interests to expand its influence in the region. This maneuver deepened the impression of a shifting balance of power away from Western dominance. Even among Israel's traditional partners, hesitation grew. Some Western allies that had historically defended Israel at international forums found themselves forced to take a more cautious line, fearing domestic criticism and the risk of losing access to Qatari energy markets. The result was a visible weakening of Israel's diplomatic shield and the emergence of unexpected partnerships rallying around Qatar. These shifting alliances illustrated a broader truth. In a world where energy, economics, and perception matter as much as military power, even a single strike can redraw the global map of loyalty and influence. The aftermath of the strike against Qatar was not only fought on the ground or in diplomatic chambers, but also in the powerful realm of media and information. Almost instantly, global news outlets placed Qatar in the spotlight as the victim of an unprovoked act of aggression, framing the narrative in ways that stirred public sympathy worldwide. Images of damaged infrastructure, displaced civilians, and leaders calling for justice flooded television screens and online platforms, amplifying Qatar's position as a small yet vital nation unjustly targeted. Israel, in contrast, found itself cast in the role of the aggressor, with its official statements struggling to counter the momentum of the story already shaping public opinion. Social media intensified the pressure, turning what might have been a regional conflict into a global conversation within hours. Hashtags condemning the strike trended across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, while videos and posts from Qatari citizens spread rapidly, humanizing the crisis and rallying international solidarity. Activists, influencers, and even public figures outside of politics joined the digital wave, calling for accountability and demanding governments act against Israel's actions. The speed of this information war meant that perceptions were being shaped faster than traditional diplomacy could respond, leaving Israel isolated in the eyes of ordinary citizens worldwide. In Europe, where media outlets already held a critical lens on Middle Eastern conflicts, coverage was especially sharp. Headlines questioned the necessity, legality, and morality of the attack, often juxtaposing Israel's military power with Qatar's role as a peaceful energy provider. The result was a narrative imbalance. Israel's justification was overshadowed by Qatar's portrayal as a stabilizing force in global energy security. Editorial boards, opinion writers, and policy commentators reinforced this framing, urging European governments to respond decisively. International organizations and human rights groups also capitalized on the media wave, releasing reports and statements that condemned the strike and demanded accountability. These publications were widely covered by mainstream outlets, further legitimizing Qatar's position in the global court of opinion. Even corporations became sensitive to the optics, as consumer-driven backlash mounted against any perceived alignment with Israel. The net effect of this information war was a dramatic shift in global perception. While Israel had often relied on strategic narratives to justify its actions in the past, this time it found itself overpowered by the sheer scale of coordinated media and public response. The story of Qatar as a victim and Israel as an aggressor dominated headlines and social feeds, creating an environment where political leaders felt compelled to act in line with public sentiment rather than conscious diplomacy. The strike on Qatar accelerated the rise of alternative power centers that had been quietly building influence but had not yet fully stepped into the spotlight. For years, the global order had been dominated by Western powers that dictated the pace of diplomacy, trade, and security arrangements. However, when Israel's action disrupted stability and exposed the vulnerability of energy markets, a vacuum of trust appeared that others were quick to fill. Nations in the Middle East and Asia sensed an opportunity to challenge the traditional dominance of the West by presenting themselves as reliable partners in times of crisis. China was among the first to act, leveraging its vast economic ties and Belt and Road commitments to offer Qatar stronger protection and deeper cooperation. Unlike Western governments, which were divided in their reactions, China spoke with clarity, framing itself as a defender of international law and the sovereignty of smaller nations. This resonated not only in Qatar but across the region, where states saw Beijing as a rising force capable of balancing Western influence. At the same time, Russia used the crisis to reinforce its own role as a key energy player, offering to stabilize supply chains disrupted by Qatar's uncertainty. These moves underscored a growing reality. The Middle East was no longer tethered exclusively to Western frameworks of power. Regional blocs also gained new momentum. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation and other multilateral bodies found renewed unity in condemning the strike and pushing for collective responses. Previously fragmented alliances began to align around shared interests, recognizing that solidarity was essential against unilateral aggression. This cohesion allowed smaller nations to amplify their voices, pushing back against the narrative that only the West could guarantee security. In Asia, India recalibrated its stance by showing stronger diplomatic alignment with Qatar, aware of its own energy dependency and the potential domestic unrest that could arise if fuel shortages hit home. This diversification of influence meant that Israel was not only facing opposition from traditional rivals, but also encountering new diplomatic fronts that had once been indifferent. The cumulative effect of these shifts was the erosion of Western monopoly over global crises. The rise of alternative power centers was no longer theoretical. It became visible in the way Middle Eastern and Asian countries stepped forward as problem solvers and protectors, while the West appeared divided and reactive. The strike on Qatar thus acted as a catalyst, accelerating a trend that had been developing quietly, the transition toward a multipolar world where no single bloc holds uncontested authority. The consequences of the strike against Qatar did not remain confined to international arenas. They reverberated deeply within Israel itself, creating a wave of unintended domestic challenges. Initially, the government sought to project strength, framing the attack as a strategic necessity. Yet as the global backlash intensified and Israel began facing diplomatic isolation, citizens started questioning the wisdom of their leaders. Public debates erupted over whether the strike truly served national interests or if it recklessly jeopardized Israel's long-term security and prosperity. The image of a confident nation defending itself was gradually replaced by growing unease about the cause of isolation in a world where interdependence defines survival. Economic consequences quickly filtered into daily life. As foreign investment slowed and trade disruptions mounted, ordinary Israelis began to feel the pinch. Prices of essential goods rose. Energy became more expensive due to strained supply chains, and small businesses reliant on international partnerships struggled to stay afloat. For a society accustomed to technological innovation and global integration, the sudden prospect of economic contraction felt like a betrayal of national progress. These pressures fueled protests in major cities, where citizens demanded accountability and transparency from political leaders. The military establishment itself faced internal debates. Senior officials worried that the strategic gamble had backfired, undermining Israel's security rather than strengthening it. Questions arose about whether the leadership had miscalculated international tolerance levels and underestimated Qatar's global leverage. Such concerns leaked into the public sphere, further shaking confidence in decision makers. Generational divides deepened as well. Younger Israelis who had grown up connected to the world through technology, education, and cultural exchange, were particularly critical of policies that threatened their global future. Many voiced fears of increasing isolation, loss of mobility, and the closing of opportunities abroad. Older generations, while often more cautious, also expressed anxiety over the strain on Israel's alliances, especially with European countries that had historically provided political cover. Religious and political factions exploited the crisis to advance their narratives, with some blaming the leadership for arrogance and others calling for even more aggressive posturing. This polarization made governance more difficult as consensus eroded and parliamentary debates grew increasingly heated. What was intended as a demonstration of power abroad ended up exposing fractures at home, highlighting the limits of unilateral action in an interconnected world. The strike's domestic consequences reveal that Israel's greatest challenge was not only external isolation, but also the erosion of internal trust, unity, and stability. Ladies and gentlemen, as we reflect on the chain of events that followed Israel's strike on Qatar, one lesson becomes crystal clear. In today's interconnected world, no action exists in isolation. What was meant to be a display of strength became the trigger for global backlash, economic retaliation, shifting alliances, and a fierce battle in the media. It opened doors for new power centers to rise and, perhaps most importantly, exposed the cracks within Israel itself. This is not just a story of one nation's decision. It is a story of how fragile global stability can be when force is chosen over dialogue, and how quickly the world responds when energy security, justice, and sovereignty are at stake. The world of 2025 is no longer divided between the strong and the weak, but between those who respect interdependence and those who ignore it. True power does not lie in missiles or military campaigns. It lies in trust, cooperation, and the ability to build bridges when others burn them. And when that truth is ignored, even the mightiest can find themselves standing alone. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your openness to reflect on this critical issue. May this understanding guide us toward wiser choices, stronger unity, and a safer future for all. Good luck, and thank you once again